Good afternoon, guys. This will be your Chapter 8 lecture completion from this afternoon, dealing with the Carter presidency, so we're ready for the test for tomorrow. You'll also have a review session tonight at 7, and so if you do have any questions or problems, feel free to let me know so I can help you out with that. For Chapter 38, we're going to be picking up then where we left off in class today. And specifically what we're going to be looking at is taking a look at then the trends that are happening with the Jimmy Carter presidency. For Jimmy Carter's presidency, he is going to be a president who is coming in as an outsider president. And so when we study Jimmy Carter's presidency, he is going to be representing somebody who is trying to bring in a cleaning up of politics during his presidency. Meanwhile, the Republican Party is going to be having problems as it divides itself between Gerald Ford and the Eisenhower Republicans and the neoconservatives who are forming behind Ronald Reagan. Not certain why the PowerPoint is taking so long to load, and so I think I'll just leave it like this instead. So when we think about the neoconservatives, they're going to be divided on the idea of whether or not the Republican Party is heading in the right direction or Gerald Ford. And with Ronald Reagan, he is going to be helping to elevate the perspective of the new right. And what we'll see happening is a number of different things are going to be moving to the forefront for our politics in the 1970s. And so there's going to be a counter-revolution that's going on against the counterculture. So Reagan feels like things have gone the wrong direction politically, and we need to right them and move in a more conservative track. What we'll find then from this point forward is, first of all, you're going to see Republican politicians being forced to move in a more conservative direction because of what's going to be emerging with the primary process. So with primaries, we're going to find that there are going to be new challengers emerging politically to challenge Republican candidates who are tempted to move in a more liberal direction. And these primary challenges will happen before the actual election takes place in November. So when they're selecting candidates, the more conservative Republican candidates that start emerging will then demand more conservatism from the mainstream Republican candidates, and you'll see the party then moving in a more conservative way. The liberalism that you saw of Eisenhower and Nixon will become a thing of the past in the Republican Party. You're also about to see a rise of advocacy groups where you're going to see a number of individuals who have conservative views taking notes from what the liberal reform movements look like, and they'll be doing the same thing that happened in the 50s and 60s with groups like SNCC and CORE, protest movements like NOW, the National Organization of Women, and they'll be doing the same sort of tactics, but for conservative issues instead, like gun ownership or abortion opposition with the pro-life movement. And so we'll see that this is going to elevate a number of issues, like cultural issues will come to the forefront, especially with the rise of a group that refers to itself as the moral majority, representing evangelical Christians. And you're going to see a much more hawkish foreign policy moving away from détente and more towards an aggressive foreign policy towards the Russians to try to get them to back off of their Cold War aggression. Come on now. So this leads to Jimmy Carter's presidency in 1976, when Reagan challenges Gerald Ford in the primary process. A little bit of damage is done to Gerald Ford, but also the damage is done from Gerald Ford's decision to pardon Richard Nixon. So this leads to Jimmy Carter's run for presidency, and he's going to run as an outsider candidate, and he's also running as an old-school Southern Democrat who is a fundamentalist Christian. He is somebody who is skeptical about the idea of big government, especially with like LBJ and Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. So he's a Democrat, but he's a different type of Democrat, more like the ones that you saw prior to the rise of FDR. What you'll also notice, though, is just because of the fact that he's moving in a different direction than the Democratic Party, the same attack lines are going to be used against him. And so he'll be described as being a radical or a communist or an extremist by Republicans who would like to ding him. And this is going to help Ronald Reagan to gain an awful lot of traction on top of the failures that Jimmy Carter is going to have while he's president. He is going to enter into the presidency as an outsider, and his problem is he then needs to work with the people who are the insiders that he's been attacking over time. So when he moves into Congress, what he is going to be doing is cutting taxes, creating the Department of Energy to deal with our nuclear programs that we have. But with Jimmy Carter, he is going to fail to figure out ways to work within Washington, D.C. to get an awful lot of stuff done. He will pardon thousands of people who evaded the draft, which will make him very unpopular with people who are more hawkish. And he's going to find himself in struggles, especially when it comes to foreign policy. For Jimmy Carter's foreign policy, he's got a religious view that he should be taking America in a different direction, and rather than being involved in the governing of the past, he's going to be trying to focus strictly on human rights, but he will be forced to deal with all of those issues that previous presidents have dealt with. And so he's very idealistic when it comes to his foreign policy. He wants to put attention on Africa because of the fact that you've got countries that have been, since the colonial times, dominated from outside. So he sees himself as somebody who can try to figure out ways to protect human rights in that area. He also is famous for the Camp David Accords, where he brings in the leader of Egypt and Israel to sign peace accords in 1978 that does bring a limited amount of peace to the area, but also will lead to a reaction against Anwar Sadat, and he ends up as being assassinated shortly after the signing of this peace treaty. But it's a historic and monumental moment, especially for Jimmy Carter, who's a fundamentalist Christian. He teaches Bible school in his spare time. He is somebody who nowadays is involved in Habitat for Humanity, and so he sees this as a religious mission of his to try to bring peace to the Middle East. We'll find then that with Israel and with Egypt, they're going to promise to respect each other's borders. They're going to bring an end to warfare there. He will resume relations with China. He'll give the Panama Canal back to Panama with the argument that we had a treaty with them, but it was gained through militaristic means with Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. And so we're going to give the Panama Canal back, which will make a lot of people angry who are more hawkish with the idea that we are just giving away the gains that America has had in order to soothe our conscience. The other thing that Jimmy Carter is up to, though, is at that point we've got ocean liners that are far too big for the Panama Canal, and it is facing a multi-billion reconstruction at that time in order to accommodate the bigger ships. So there's a part strategic element that he is up to as well to try to figure out what to do with that structure. For Jimmy Carter, though, he is going to find himself struggling with détente because we're going to see Cuba and the Soviet Union getting involved in sending supplies and troops to places like Angola, Ethiopia, elsewhere in Africa, and they're trying to start revolutions that will then create governments that are sympathetic to the Soviet Union and sympathetic to communism. This will make then Jimmy Carter be put into a tough spot because he wants to try to figure out ways to pull back. We're still suffering from what people are calling the Vietnam Syndrome, but he's also going to need to figure out ways to put pressure on so that these insurrections are not going to be permitted. For Jimmy Carter, though, his presidency is going to be taking over from Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford is going to have a slight recession that takes place during his time period. This is your stagflation. And while the economy is going backwards, it does bring inflation down to only 6% per year, but that's still a really large inflation rate that's taking place. When Jimmy Carter took over, we're going to see the inflation rate soar. And so a double-digit inflation rate is never good for the country. And then what we're going to have is we're going to see inside of our country another set of oil shocks where we're going to have the Iranians cut off our oil yet again. And we're going to see that this causes an awful lot of problems for the United States. They're also going to be finding that it's very difficult to be able to have economic isolation like we had previously, where we pulled back from the rest of the world and focused on American trade because we are so dependent on trading with other places. Notice then that what's happening during Jimmy Carter's presidency, these are all called the misery index, where we have a bunch of things going wrong that are causing problems. We've got a budget deficit that is large. When you see the prime rate right here, this is the rate that the Federal Reserve is charging banks to borrow from them. And so this is considered to be the best rate possible to be able to borrow money, and it's 20%, which means if you're buying a house during this time period, your interest rate is somewhere between 20 to 30+% to buy your house, which is massive. For comparison, we're now in the single digits inside the United States, and we have been for a while. For Jimmy Carter, he is going to point out that inflation is tied to this foreign oil problem that we have, where we're dependent on other countries. But what Jimmy Carter is going to propose then is he's going to talk about making efforts to cut back as Americans so we can then have enough resources to be able to survive. Like, he wants to drive 55 miles per hour. He wants to be able to turn down the thermostats to the low 60s. And so he's talking about sacrifice, kind of like what we were asked to do during World War I and World War II. The problem that he's facing, though, is that there's large insurrections that are firing up in the Middle East that are very much nationalistic in nature. So when we learned about Iran in the 1950s, we put somebody into place called the Shah of Iran, and this guy is going to unfortunately get cancer in 1979. He is going to then fly off to the Mayo Clinic here in Minnesota, and when he leaves, he is going to be replaced by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is a fundamentalist Muslim who is going to very much hate the United States, calling it the Great Satan. And this will then lead to an oil shock where Iran's oil fields will then be offline. OPEC will then cut off our oil again, and we're going to end up in a gas shortage that's going to hurt us a second time. When Jimmy Carter goes into Camp David in 1979, he then asks for people to give him ideas as far as how to fix the situation. And when he comes out of that, he delivers a speech called the Malaise speech, where essentially he says that the reason why America is struggling is that we're having a moral and spiritual crisis where we are too beholden to material goods. And so if you listen to the message that's happening there, that is a very much a fundamentalist Christian speech describing an extravagance that's happening inside the United States. And he's talking about the need for all of us to cut back, to sacrifice, so that we can then deal with the fact that our oil is going to be constrained either for the short time or for a long time. For many people who are listening to the speech, though, the Malaise speech becomes something that Jimmy Carter gets mocked for, with the idea that we are not a country that needs to be scrimping and saving and sacrificing. Instead, neoconservatives led by Ronald Reagan are going to argue that we are in a great country. We are a city on a hill, and we don't need to have perpetual inflation that is going out of control. We don't need the economy to be out of control like this. And stagflation is definitely going to be blamed on Jimmy Carter personally in the 1980 election for making it far worse and for making America weak. When we look then at what the energy crisis, stagflation, and Carter are going to do, is it's going to lead to a conservative movement, and it's going to be backlashing against these things. The idea that the federal government should be strong, created with the Franklin Roosevelt and LBJ time period, is going to be challenged. So is the idea of economic regulation. Many people are willing to listen to the idea that the economy is struggling because of overregulation by government. Many people are going to be also questioning what is going on with the social contract that's being created with safety nets for people. And there's a question of, are we being too extravagant with things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security? And there's also concern about this gap that's emerging between rich people and poor people. And so the push that's going to happen with neoconservatives is they're going to be pushing the idea that if we can establish free markets that move away from big government, we can then protect ourselves from the economic downturns that we're finding. For these neoconservatives, they are very much people who are turned off by the 1960s and the stuff that's going on with the counterculture. They very much are in favor of free market capitalism, like we talked about with Milton Friedman, the idea of lower taxes, lower regulations, and cutting government programs, especially programs like the Great Society and the welfare programs that were created by that, which they claim are creating dependency on the government. They're also very much about traditional values. So remember the moral majority that I referenced previously, and you'll be good there. And then they are very much hawkish about the USSR, or the Soviet Union. And they're rejecting Keynesian economics at this time, especially for its failure to deal with stagflation. When we look at conservatives, they're going to realize that they should organize, much like the liberals did with their groups like SNCC and CORE or NOW. And so what they're going to create is called political action committees, also known as PACs. And you'll hear about them as we move forward when we talk about PACs and super PACs. And what these corporations are going to do is they're going to be working inside these political action committees to lobby Congress to do things like to weaken labor and union regulations, very much being concerned about minimum wages, The concerns they have are about the Consumer Protection Agency, which is going to be something that is intended to try to protect consumers from behaviors in business that might be predatory. For conservatives, they're going to be making their case that this is the reason why the economy is going wrong. We've got too much regulation in transportation, communication, banking, and those things need to be unwound. Now, many of these regulations, though, came from the push from reformers who were concerned about the rise of monopolies and the damage done by the Great Depression. And so what's being done at this point is an argument's being created that the issues of the New Deal are now gone. The Great Depression concerns that we had previously will be fixed by instead moving towards what Milton Friedman is describing. But Milton Friedman's views are very similar to what you saw with the economists of the 1920s of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. So we're going to be back to that same debate that's happening. But then we'll also find that during this time period, younger Democrats are also moving in the same direction. Many people who are in the Democratic Party are concerned about what they saw going on with the Great Society too. And so you'll see with Jimmy Carter, he is this sort of president where he is not a New Dealer, but he will be labeled one by the neoconservatives who want to attack him. Same thing with Bill Clinton. He'll describe a new time period for the economy. And we'll find that for Democrats, they're going to be painted with that brush of being New Dealers, even though they are softening on that stance. We're also going to find that during this time period, Republicans and Democrats are going to embrace the idea of free markets, the idea that we should get rid of tariffs and open up trade overseas so that we can then take advantage of trade not just inside of our country, but also in other countries. This is also being spurred by what happens in California, where they have a proposition that they put through that makes it very difficult for the California legislature to pass any sort of taxes from now into the future. The feeling is that they're overtaxed in California, and so they're going to be setting the trend for conservatives in other parts of the country to reject taxation and to try to move in the idea of instead becoming more thrifty with their spending. For Jimmy Carter, notice also SALT II. SALT II is a treaty that is intended to rein in our nuclear arsenals, and we're going to find that this treaty is going to struggle when it gets into the Congress, and eventually it will end up failing. For Jimmy Carter also, he is embarrassed by a couple other different things. In November of 1979, after the Shah of Iran is deposed, our embassy got stormed, and we ended up having our embassy workers being held against their will as hostages for the better part of a year. And we will find that for Jimmy Carter, he is going to struggle with how to deal with that. In December of 1979, the Russians are going to invade Afghanistan, and when they do so, they're moving towards an oil-rich area, and Afghanistan itself is very much resource-rich. So what we'll see with Jimmy Carter is he's going to react in ways where he's going to cut off trade that we had recently established with the Russians. He is going to call a boycott on the Olympic Games in Moscow. And he's also going to secretly start funding counterinsurgencies inside Afghanistan, where we will start sending in our CIA and special forces to start supplying them with weapons and materials so that they can turn Afghanistan into a Vietnam-type experience for the Russians to have, just like we've had. What we'll have then also is during this time, Jimmy Carter is pushing for the creation of a Delta Force, which is meant to be a rapid deployment force to be able to go overseas and deal with military threats. He wants to recreate another draft so that we are able to have the troops necessary to be able to protect the United States. He also talks about being very tough in protecting the Persian Gulf, and that he is going to also admit to the fact that his policy with the Soviet Union has now struggled, and we're now in a crisis because of that. For the Iran hostage crisis, this is the hardest thing for Jimmy Carter to overcome in the 1980 election. The Iranians are able to hold the Americans against their will, and the Americans, by trying out economic sanctions or pressure, are going to fail in that respect. And then they try to stage a gigantic invasion, sending in the special forces. And when they do so, their equipment starts failing. They have planes crash out in the desert. And this is an embarrassing moment for the United States, and it's played all over the TV. For Jimmy Carter, then, when we close out the 1970s, Americans are now feeling that there's been a moment that's lost, and so our prosperity is going away. We have a brand new conservative movement that is successfully challenging the New Deal and the Great Society mentalities with the support for free markets and criticizing of government for being out of control, and especially that credibility gap that we discussed in class is helping out with that. We're going to see a gap between rich and poor emerging, and also polarization developing between Democrats and Republicans that's going to make it really hard to compromise from now into the future. We're also finding, though, that in society a lot of things are changing in order to try to deal with the fact that we are now much more tolerant than we were generations earlier in all the different groups that you see listed right here. But we're also still facing a lot of tensions that those reforms caused. And then finally, Jimmy Carter is making some very tough choices, because with Paul Volcker, he is going to be deciding to increase interest rates massively towards the end of the 1970s. And what he is going to be doing is he's going to be trying to figure out ways to rein in inflation. And the path he's going to do that with is by making interest rates so high that people stop borrowing money. The idea is then we'll shrink the money supply and prices will start dropping. This will deal with inflation, but what that means is that will then hurt poorer people in the country who are dependent on being able to get cheap loans or being able to depend on government spending. We're going to now see that deflationary cycle is typically not good for people who are struggling economically, but it is very good for people who already have quite a bit of cash. And so we'll see a deflationary trend take place, and that will usher in the 1980s, where Reagan will continue these hard choices. The economy will then recover, but it recovers only for some. Others are going to see, as we saw with the chart today, that the pay raises that they had been depending on in the past aren't happening anymore. And they don't really have much hope that they're going to be getting them popping up in the future as well. So it's this curve right here. And as you see moving in the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of people are going to find themselves just locked into a standard level where their wages aren't increasing the way that it used to. And it's going to create a feeling of tension that we still have going on to today. Hopefully that helps. Review session again is going to be happening in a couple hours. So good luck with your study.